Get started. It's 5 o'clock, almost a full room. This is fantastic. My name is Matt Mason. I am on the Power BI product team. I've been at Microsoft about 10 years now, a little over 10 years, working in the space of data integration. I've worked on a lot of different products, and for the past couple of years, I've been focused on a product called Power Query, and specifically the engine behind Power Query and a programming language called M, or data transformation language called M. And that's what this talk today is about. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Power Query UI. I'm going to show some of the features and then dig into the language underneath. I don't expect to teach you a new language in my 90-minute session or 75-minute session, but I will kind of show you the type of things that you can do and the type of things, the data transformation and data wrangling scenarios that are unlocked by this language behind Power Query. So how many people here have never used Power Query before, never seen it? OK, half the audience. OK, so you've come to a 300 level advanced session. That's great. You guys are very brave. Well, have fun. Good luck. OK, so let's talk a bit about Power Query and sort of where we came. You won't see the brand Power Query anywhere, but when I say Power Query, I refer to these different experiences. And one thing you'll notice is that this experience is rolling out across multiple products. So Power Query started off as an extension for Excel. You can download it. Now it's built into Excel 2016. I don't know if you guys have this build yet, but in a near future, the Data tab in Excel will actually become Power Query. That will actually be the main way to connect to data. And so you see here, you have this drop down. You can connect, and it's called the Get and Transform Data experience. It's actually the exact same experience that we ship in Power BI Desktop, just skinned a little bit differently. And you see we switched from that ribbon drop down to this Get Data dialog, and that was primarily because now we're up to 74 data sources in Power BI Desktop. We ship 2 or 3 new sources a month, wide range of data sources. We've actually run out of space in the drop downs. So my demos today revolve around Power BI Desktop because that is the version that we ship every single month. So Power Query first came out 3 years ago. In those 3 years, we've shipped 34 times. The only times we skip are around December, Christmas time. Shipping every month lets us address customer feedback. And I think that's one of the things people got most excited about Power Query is that we are constantly listening to feedback. We constantly follow the ideas.powerbi.com forum where you can make suggestions for features and connectors. And that essentially drives our backlog. And because of this tight feedback loop, Power Query has really evolved over the past 3 years. One of the newer places you'll see the Power Query experience land is now in analysis services. So specifically for analysis services tabular models. So this is in the new customer preview build for SQL Server Data Tools. But you'll see the exact same Power Query experience embedded inside of SSDT now. And you'll see this roll out across multiple products, reporting services, and other products in the future. One of the things these experiences have in common is this query editor, right? So in Power Query, you can connect to a data source, one of our many data sources you can connect to, and say, OK, I want to import all the data. But the power comes in when you actually build your queries, right? And this UI, this whole experience is targeted at the business analyst who wants really quick ways to filter, shape, transform their data without actually having to write code. So while this talk focuses on the underlying language, focuses on M, I'd say that about 80% of users never touch the language, never touch the formula bar. They just click around and build their queries because the UI does everything that they need to do. So why is this experience so popular? Breadth of connectivity, as I've mentioned, but not only the breadth of connectivity, but the consistency that we provide across these different data sources. Right? So in Excel could already connect to a number of data sources, and each one of those connectivity experiences were different. Right? If you connect to a text file, it's a very different experience than connecting to a database, to connecting to an OData server. Right? What Power Query did is normalize this. Right? So whether I'm connected to a text file or a database, I can do the same set of transformations. I have the same experience. I don't have to learn the intricacies of each data source. Right? And we'll talk about how Power Query applies its transformations, about query folding, about pushing work back to the server throughout this talk. Joins is the other thing. So originally when Power Query first launched and the M language came out, M stood for mashup, data mashup, and this idea of being able to connect to multiple sources and bring it together. Microsoft's self-service BI platform one of its main strengths is that it does allow business analysts to not have to rely on IT, but to be able to connect to multiple data sources, say an Excel file and a database file, and augment the data, connect to the data themselves, and quickly transform the data that they need into the shape that they need without programming, without IT involvement. So Power BI Desktop, Microsoft used to have, in the previous self-service BI story, we had Power View and Power Pivot and Power Query and all these different Power technologies, and it was a bit confusing. Power BI Desktop released it all as one, right? And so if you think about the end-to-end flow of what an analyst would go through, Power Query is really that starting point. It's the place where you connect to the data. It's where you grab the data and bring it in to your data model. After you've grabbed the data, you define your relationships, you can define calculations, and this is essentially the Power Pivot experience that you would have had in Excel. Power Pivot uses a language called DAX for creating formulas, KPIs, expressions, and things like that, and that run within the in-memory engine that Power Pivot has. Once you've created your model, you start visualizing it, right? You drag on, create your pretty charts, pretty reports. You can publish it to Power BI, and this is where you create your dashboards and you start sharing out. You can create mobile experiences, right? So what I'm focused on today is just this first part, the getting the data experience, right? And the whole data integration space has always really interested me because it's very easy to create these flashy BI demos and everything looks great, and then you sit down to do it and your data doesn't match up and you have to clean the data, and it never actually works that way. And anybody who's actually done an actual BI solution knows that about 80% of their time is just spent at the beginning phase of filtering and shaping and getting to the data, getting the data into the shape they need. And that's always fascinated me. And I love that the Microsoft products keep getting easier and easier to use to get there. So I'm going to go quickly over Power Query for those people who haven't seen it. I'll talk a bit about our connectivity experience, the different data transformations you can do, this concept of query folding, and then data mashup. So let me just switch over. Great. So this is the latest version of Power BI Desktop. As I said, it ships monthly. I am going to click this Get Data box. It's going to bring up this Get Data experience. And I'm going to start just by connecting to a CSV file. I'm going to browse to my data, customer CSV data. And I get this preview pane. Preview pane is pretty consistent. If it's a structured data source that has say I connect to SQL Server and databases, I'll see a navigator where I can navigate to the data I want. If it's a flat data source like a CSV file, I'll get a preview and maybe some settings, like I could change the delimiter or how many rows to scan to do type detection, stuff like that. I can click the load button down here to load it straight into Power BI if I'm happy with the data as it is. But if I can click edit, it brings up this great Power Query experience. A couple things to call out. I can have multiple queries on the side. I have a preview of the data. We always bring in a preview, so you can work with very large data sets, and we just bring in at most the top 1,000 rows of data. And I can start doing some transformations. So for example, I can right-click and split my full name column by comma, say the leftmost, drag this over here. Here's my first, and here's my last name. And I see that there's extra spacing in here, so I can right-click and say, actually, I'll just do, I will right-click and say transform trim to get rid of any white space. And now, as I did those different transformations, you saw my steps increased over here. And using the steps, I can actually click back through and see the data as I changed it, as I did things. One of the things we do is we rely on feedback to find out what are the most commonly used transforms, what are people trying to do, and we add those transformations to our transformation toolbar. So you can usually find them there. They're on the right-click context menu. There's also a lot of transformations that aren't exposed, that are actually built into the engine that you can hand code, and I'll show you how to get to those later on. Okay, so let's do something interesting like, okay, here I have a phone number. I want to normalize my phone number. So I say replace values. I want to replace a dash with an empty space. Now I've transferred my numbers. And this is self-service BI, so I could do what I want. And I'm going to convert my phone number rather than text. I'm going to make it a whole number. Great. And if I scroll down, down to lower my data set, I see I actually have error values. You see the error cell there, and the error says can't convert to number because obviously my phone number wasn't properly converted, so I get those nice error messages. Again, this is self-service BI. I don't have to be accurate. I'm just going to remove all my error rows and just ignore them completely. Now let's do something like grouping. Yeah, sure. Let's count on the last name. It's great, just on a group by. And maybe I don't want that. And actually looking at my data, I can actually see there's some duplicates there, right? Like I see duplicate values here. So I can actually say, okay, click this and say remove duplicates. Great, now I've deduped my list with a couple clicks. Let's do another interesting aggregate. Let's do a operation of sum the phone number, and this will be called sum of phone. And this is a very useful self-service report. And so now I have the sum of phone numbers grouped by last name off a text file. I'm not connected to a backend engine. And this is just all done locally, really simply with a couple of clicks. So let's see what it looks like when I connect to an actual data source. I'll connect to a local SQL Server database. And I see I have this nice navigator experience. I see all my different databases that have been deployed to my local database. I can expand. I can select a table like the product dimension, and I get a nice preview here. Let's select that, click OK. And I'll call out a couple of things. So it's brought in a preview of the data. When I scroll over to the right, I actually see that I have these structured columns. And so we call these navigation properties. And so what Power Query has done is looked at the schema of the database and seen these foreign key relationships, and they bring in what we call these virtual navigation columns. And from here, I can expand those rows, which essentially do a join on the back end. So it's basically an easier way than connecting to multiple queries and joining them together with our Merge Queries button, and I'll show that too. This actually lets me expand. Any idea why one is a value and one is a table? Question. So it comes down to cardinality. So with a one-to-one, you'd have a value, it would give you a structured record, and a table would be a one-to-many mapping. And I can actually click and see, if I click on this value, for example, well, null isn't interesting, but, and that's not interesting either. Let's get rid of these null values. So anywhere where subcategory key is null, and I say number filters does not equal to null. Now if I scroll over and click this, I can actually see a preview of the data down below, what that value is actually linked to. OK, so let's do some more filtering and shaping. I can do choose columns, which is a really handy feature when you're working with a lot of columns. Let's do product key, alternate key, English product name, and let's take the dim product subcategory. Now I can click this magic expand column button, and it will show me all the columns that are linked to that record or table or whatever I've linked to. And I can basically do an inline join. So I'm going to select just English category name and the product category. And then I'm going to expand this further. So do a second expand on product category. Let's rename those. So this is subcats, and this is cats. And let's reorder that. Now a bit more of a meaningful report. So if we go to the actual SQL database that I was connected to, and let's run a SQL trace, because I want to show you the SQL that we actually passed down there. If I click refresh, what refresh does is it forces a reevaluation of the query to not use the local cache. And if I go down to here, I'll actually see a number of queries that were run. And which is the interesting one? Is it this one? That one looks interesting. So I can actually see in the generated table, we pushed down things like the rename, right? That cat and subcat. Where's my filter? I applied the filter is not null. You see that pushed down. And you can see there's actually two joins being done from the product to subcategory and subcategory to category. Right? So all this was pushed down to the backend service, backend server, whatever we're connected to, does all of the actual join and aggregation work for us. Okay? And one of the magic things about Power Query is I was able to do the same type of aggregation to a text file where there is no engine, which means it gets evaluated locally, that I can do against an engine like SQL Server that will take care of the work for me. It'll just be slower when it happens local. Make sense? So let's look at explicit joins. So that worked because I was connected to a single data source, and we could push all the joins down to the backend system. If I connect to another file, so for example, this time let's connect to an Excel file that I've recently connected to. I get this nice structured view because I might have multiple sheets of data or multiple lists of data. Click OK. So I have products. So this is sales information from my products table. Right? So this is basically my fact data. I select my product key. I click the Merge Queries button. Merge is our user-friendly terminology for doing a join. I pick my Excel data with my data coming out of SQL Server. I choose what kind of join I want to do. So for example, I want to do an inner join. Click OK. I have a new column now, which is my joined data. I can see a preview of that data down here. And I want to expand this in line. So I'm going to say, give me the product name and the category information. And so now I've joined my Excel data and SQL data together, right? And the joins that I did on the one table will be pushed down to SQL Server. The rest will be evaluated locally. And we can be very smart about combining data. We might push down filters from one side to another. And yeah, we can actually build these very efficient queries just with a couple of clicks. I don't actually have to write SQL code. Any questions on that? Take a couple. No? Great. So that is Power Query in a nutshell. Let me jump back to my slide deck, and I will go through, call out some of the key features around this programming language called M. So I'll call it M is not a general purpose programming language. It is a data transformation language. It is specifically meant for Power Query. So you can think of M as almost a domain-specific language or a DSL for the Power Query UI. As someone who uses M often, I find myself using Power Query to do my visual transformation because I can do it very quickly. And then I will go into the code and actually tweak things if I have to, or do some more of the advanced stuff that you wouldn't be able to do with a UI. Some of those key features in that UI. Right, so we have, at the top, we have the transformation bar with all the different transformations that you can have. We have a formula bar, which will, every time you click a transformation, basically adds a new step. Each step has a formula associated with it. One thing I forgot to show on the last thing was the advanced editor, another button you can click that will actually show you end to end what this program actually looks like. Okay? The other, well, let's talk about a bit about the language flow, and then I want to go back into query folding for a bit. So the key thing to know about the M language flow is that it flows from one step to the next, except for when it doesn't. But this is the way the UI generates it, right? So here on my first line, I'm connecting to a web page, which is my web.contents. That's going to return a binary to web.page, which is going to parse that binary as a web page and extract some tables. And that stores it in a variable called source. Source is used on the next line, where I'm iterating in to grab the first item of the list of data in there and refer to the data table. That gets stored as a web table variable. And then I'm using web table in the following line, where I do a table.rename columns. I'm renaming column 1 to rank, column 2 to 2013. Store that in rename columns, and then return it as my return value. You can think of the let statement as sort of a scope for a given query. And the in statement is going to be what you're actually returning from that query. Okay? This is the type of code that the Power Query UI would generate, because you're going step by step and you're working table by table. There's a question back there?
So by in,
I mean out. Yes, that is very good. That is not the first time I've heard that, but thank you. I usually use that as a joke, and yes, anyways, I'm glad you called it out. So this is a handwritten query, right? This is something I've written myself where my first line, SQL.database, I'm connecting to my local host, AdventureWorks table. I store that as source, and then I reference that source 3 different times to pull in my product category, my subcategory, and my customer table. Then my final line, I'm doing a nested join between subcat and cat on the category key. I never actually reference dim customer in this case. Right? And so this is where that lazy evaluation comes in. And we'll do a couple of things when it looks end-to-end at that query. It might reorder steps if it makes sense, if it's more efficient. Also, if you don't actually pull on the value, so I never actually reference dim customer, it would never get evaluated. It would just be dropped off of the execution graph entirely. Okay, and that's what I mean by lazy. Query folding is that other important concept I want to call out. So Power Query will push as much work as possible to the backend source. So in this query here, I am connecting to a SQL database. In the UI, I would, so I've selected dim product. I would do a select specific column. So I'm just selecting product key and English product name. I rename one of the columns, and I apply a filter. I say product key is less than 10. So those are the 3 actions I do in the UI. This is the M program that would be generated by the Power Query UI. At runtime, what happens is the M engine would look at this end-to-end and collapse it down to a single SQL statement. Right? So we call this query folding. Other people call it predicate pushdown or filter pushdown. But like I said, we try to push as much work as possible to the back end. This isn't limited to SQL. We can do it to basically any source that has a language. For REST APIs, we might set query parameters. We can do Active Directory and push down to LDAP query language, OData. We can fold to MDX on top of analysis services. So we have basically all of our connectors, and what makes them special, makes them a bit more complex than regular connectors, is the fact that they can advertise the set of capabilities that they actually support. Right? So we can get the most efficiency out of these queries that we're building. I'll go quickly over the language. This deck is available through the Ignite site, so you can download, use these as reference. A couple of things I want to call out, though, around types. There's a number of primitive types in M. They tried to keep it as simple as possible. So for example, you won't see a wide variety of number types. There's just a single number type. And they did this on purpose. They tried to keep it as simple as possible for the BI user, right? It's just a number. I don't have to, or just text. I'm not worried if it's a varchar 50 or a varchar 51, right? It's just all text to the M engine. The only real explosion of types is around dates, because you need to be specific. A date is different than a date time. M also supports the native concepts of complex types, so lists, records, and tables. We'll talk a bit more about that later. When you're writing M or when you're doing stuff in the UI, in general, you don't worry about types too much. But it is helpful when you're defining a function to specify what types are expected, and the UI can do some handy things around that, give warnings when types don't match and things like that. The other thing to call out is that M is loosely typed in that it doesn't do any type checking at runtime. So if you tell M that a column is a number column but is actually text, everything will run fine until you actually call a function that requires a number, and things will blow up.
How do you deal with authentication?
How authentication works?
Yeah, do you actually do any of that, or you just have to have the same account?
So the question is around authentication, right? I skipped over that on purpose. But the way authentication works in Power Query is the first time you connect to a data source, you will be prompted. And so you get a query prompt. And actually, I can delete my credentials and show that. After you log in for the first time, we cache the credentials locally on your machine so that you're not reprompted every time you connect. And the credentials are stored separately from the workbook that you're working on. So when you share your workbook with somebody, the credentials don't go with it. It's always local, always encrypted with your own user key and things like that. There's a way to view all entered credentials. I could show that in Power BI Desktop. But yeah, I sort of skipped over that. In general, we support as many authentication types as possible for a given source. Right? Ascribe types. This is one of the more complicated concepts. It took me a while to wrap my head around. But I call this out because in the UI, you'll see lots of different types. You can think of an ascribe type as a format that is applied to a number. So M only understands a number type, but you can say, okay, it is a number type, but it is a currency or a percentage or an int64. Right? So you can think of it more as a format applied on top. And tools like Power Pivot would take advantage of this and do different operations depending on the actual type. Literals, other thing I want to call out is these handy helpers. If you are typing in your own values, these are essentially constructors that you can use to create these types. You can create lists. Lists have curly brackets like this. So this would be a list of 1, 2, 3, and the string of hello world. Lists aren't typed. You can have any number of types in a single list. Records have square brackets. Right? A record can be thought of as a structured type or a complex type or user-defined type. And what I've declared here is a record with a field of name, a field of children that's a list, and a field of happy, which is a logical or Boolean value set to true. And then I can have a table, and there's constructors for creating your own tables. One of the things in M is that it is a functional language. There's no loops. Everything is a table, and you have to think of as a table. If you want to do a for each operation, for example, you declare a table, and you add a column that will be called or evaluated for every row in your table. And thinking tabular, like I call it, thinking of everything as a table, it took me a while to latch onto. I'm not a computer science person. I'm probably the worst possible person to be teaching you about a language. But once you start getting those table and functional concepts, it all sort of comes together. Some other advanced stuff, you can write your own functions. And really, as a business analyst, as an end user, this is where you would most likely go into the advanced editor to write code. It is to define a function, something that's reusable. The demo I'll show later, for example, will iterate over a number of web pages to pull in the same data from a set of pages. You can declare types, which is more of an advanced thing, and there's actually a full binary library. If you search online, I have a blog post that has an M program that is able to parse a PNG file and extract header information to display all the header info. So you can actually do some binary parsing. It's very advanced M. I wouldn't recommend it unless you are an expert. Although recently I saw a blog post where a guy was actually opening up zip files with M and extracting information from it. I was very impressed. It's amazing how many smart people there are out there. Last thing about the language, because everything, as I was saying, everything revolves around tables, right? So in this query, I'm connecting to an Excel workbook. Actually, I connect to a file that passes the binary back to our Excel workbook parser. From source, I'm doing an item lookup, basically, a lookup where the item is equal to data and the kind is equal to sheet, and then I grab its data. And that data becomes my table of data. So if you think about the table, a column in that table is a list. So if I said my table product key, I get a list of numbers. If I wanted to refer to a single row, for example, my table 2, so M is 0-based index rather than 1, which drives Excel users crazy. It's also case sensitive, which also drives Excel users crazy. But if I want to refer to the third row of my table, it would look like this, and I'd get back a record with all of my columns as fields in that record. Finally, if you think of a table is actually a list of records, right? So it's this whole thing, my list of columns with each record. I called this out. Remember I talked about those navigation properties, right? Those things that I saw at the end of my table that I could expand inline. When I import the table into Excel or into Power BI Desktop, those columns disappear most of the time. If they're navigation properties, they'll just simply disappear. Other times, if they're actual complex type that's pulled from the data source, they actually come out just as a string. The reason why this happens is that for BI, the way Power BI Desktop works and the way Excel works, is your data has to be flattened. It has to be a literal or a set of primitives, right, for it to be visualized. charts and things like that don't know how to deal with complex types. They don't know how to deal with lists, right? So basically, everything has to be flattened out before you import it in. And if for some reason your query does have those columns, it gets replaced with a simple string, right, to indicate that you might want to flatten this out. That can be very confusing when you first start looking at it. And there's a bunch of different syntax. This is more for reference than anything else. The two interesting ones that I'll call out are the ampersand, which means concatenation. This means you can concatenate two strings together. You can also concatenate lists. You can concatenate tables and records. You just basically glue these things together. The other is the question mark. So what this means is, well, what this one means, the field access means give me the F field. And if there is no F field in this record, throw an error. If I have a question mark, it says give me the F field. And if there is no F field, give me null. So it's a safer way to reference. And the other thing, if you are writing your own functions and they have to be recursive, you have to include an @ sign before the function name call to say that it is going to be recursive. OK, the most complicated part of the talk, unary functions. And this took me a while to understand. A lot of the functions in our library take a single argument, right? So for example, table.selectRows, you pass in your table, and then you pass in a function that evaluates to say which rows you want to select. So what this means is that R is the row. R goes into evaluation where we try to compare manager to buddy. And if manager is equal to buddy, it means select the row. Okay, so this is basically going to go through all of your rows in your table and select all of the rows where manager is equal to buddy. Because this is such a common pattern, this unary function thing where we pass in a row or pass in a single object, there's a syntax helper called each. And you'll see the UI generate this all the time, this magic each word. And when you use each, it just means operate over each element of what you're passing in. And there's a shortcut where you can say underscore, which means the current object, manager buddy. And then to simplify the shorthand, you can eliminate the underscore. And anytime you do a field reference, it just assumes that you're applying to the current record, which matches closer to the DAX syntax. So these three things are equivalent. They mean the exact same thing. If you code it, it comes out to the same way. This is the type of syntax. This last one is what will be generated in the UI. And so I like to call that out just so you're familiar with it. Last thing about the code, and then the rest of this talk is all demos. There's conditional expressions, so if, then, and else. The let expression, like I talked about before, is more for scoping. So you can scope everything within a single let statement. An error expression is like a throwing an error, right? Think of it as a throw in a programming language. A try is like a catch. So you can say, try this, otherwise that, right? So the most common thing here is try to access this web page, and if you get an error, return null, rather than returning an actual error and stopping query evaluation, right? Great. So that was a whirlwind tour of the language. Like I said, the slides are going to be available, so you can download and refer to them as much as you'd like. Let me now switch over. So what I'm going to do is take a look at creating blank queries, like just basically typing in queries from scratch. We will look at calculated columns, which is usually the other way you will be writing M. And then we will take a look at writing your own functions. I need to switch things over. OK, fantastic. Let me close this one, and I will start a brand new project. And I'll remember to show you the advanced query editor. And there was a question about credentials before. If I go to data source settings and say global permissions, these are all my cached credentials that I've used before. And if I say edit permissions, I'd see the type of database prompt that would appear the first time I connect to a data source. So if I were to send this workbook to somebody else, the first time you say refresh, you'd get this prompt that says, please tell me how to connect and how to authenticate. Okay? Great. So let's start with a blank query. So one of my options under get data is blank query. come up here, here's my query bar. So if I type a formula like this, I get a string because I didn't actually make it a formula. So let's make it a formula. 1 plus 1, 2. 2 times 8. Great. So I can do some really simple expressions. I can type in functions. And there's a very handy function here called #shared. What #shared does is shows me all of the functions that are available to my engine. Right? So basically all of the functions, including all data source access, all the table functions, everything is listed. And if I click on one of these functions, so for example, what's a good one? Like this, it will show me the actual function signature down below. That's #shared. Let's type in one of the functions I want. So list.dates. Whoops. That's not what I want. List.dates. So in this case, I've typed in a function name just by itself. And what it gives me is a description of the function and a sample screen where I can enter parameters, and it will even give me samples down here. You'll see that a lot of this stuff matches the documentation that we have in MSDN and in Office Help. That's all driven or generated from the metadata that we include in the functions. You can actually write your own functions in a way that display the same metadata. So if you're sharing the workbook to other users and they want to know more about the function, it can be decorated in the same way. So with list.dates, what it lets me do is generate a list of dates from a starting value. So let's say January 1st. My count is 365, and my step is 1. So it's going to be 1 day. Now I have a list of dates. Can't really do too much interesting things with a list, so I'll convert it to a table. Let's call this the date column. I'll convert the type to dates. And now I have a list of dates. So what I'm going to do here is actually create a date dimension, a really common thing in a data warehousing scenario. So I click Add Custom Column, and here I get this formula editor. So in this case, I want to call a function called date.year. And I'll pass in the date column. Let's call this year. OK. Now I have a year column. Let me do another custom column here. We'll call this month. And I think you get an idea of what I am doing here. I can even do this. Let me zoom back out. Great, now I have a day and a month. And this can get fairly complex. Let me launch something. So this is something that you guys don't have, but I have because I'm on the product team. And you will eventually have. One thing you'll notice that today in Power BI Desktop, there's no real query editing, there's no syntax highlighting for the language. What I like working with is why didn't my file open? Oh, there it is. Actually, I do have syntax highlighting. I find writing without syntax highlighting is quite difficult. So here is a full date dimension function that I can take. Come in here, so you don't have to watch me type. I'll go to the advanced editor. And this is the M program that I have created so far. So you see, I do have minor syntax highlighting here. This is a feature that we announced at TechEd in US in October, September, whenever that was. We haven't quite shipped it yet. Our PM likes to say it'll ship any day now, just not today. It demos great. There's actually some outstanding issues here that if I have a really complex query, things freeze up and crash, which isn't good. But I have a preview build here, which is good for sample purposes. I'll just paste in this M query in here. And what this is doing is defining a new function that I've created, which gives me a start date, which will be my January 1st, an end date, which will be January 2018, and I even have a culture. So let's do enus invoke. And what this has done is generated a full date dimension for me. Right? I even have month name as text. day of the week, week ending, week and day, right? All the common things that you'd see out of a date dimension. And notice this formula bar up here, right? I can actually see my function invocation that has my enus. If I want to change this to something like fr, so for French, I see that things have now switched over to the French version of the date, right? And the functions that I'm calling underneath is basically a text.format that are locale sensitive. I could even have multiple columns for every locale that I wanted to include in my date dimension just built right in. Right, so that's the useful helper M function that you can use. If you search online, there'll be blog posts that we'll talk about. Actually, I think I blogged about it last year. And since then, I've seen multiple MVP blog posts that have their own variations of date dimensions in different cultures and different settings and what different organizations would actually need. OK, so let's do something a little bit more interesting. It's one of my favorite demos that I've been doing for a while. This is a site called Box Office Mojo, and it shows top grossing movies year over year. And the interesting thing about the data set is that it's paged across multiple pages, right? So each page will show 100 rows of data max. You might have times in the past where you've hit a web page and you say, well, I really want to scrape or I really want to extract data from these multiple pages. And I will show you how to do that. And it's gotten easier and easier. We used to have to type lots of code. This demo, they keep improving the UI, and now it's very easy to do. I don't actually have to write much code. I'm going to start by copy and pasting the URL. I will say new source, web, paste in that URL. And it's going to go out and pull in the page. It's going to try to parse it. It basically tries to look for everything that looks like a table. The top level says document, which means it's going to give me the entire HTML breakdown of the document, including head and body and all parts of the document. I see it's found one table, and this doesn't quite look like what I want. It just looks like a navigation table or navigation bar. And table 1 ends up being the actual data that I want. I see my ranks. I see the movies. OK, this looks right. We also have a web view, which is a recently added feature, which gives you, it's very similar to the import from web experience in Excel today in the data tab, where I can actually get a view and I can see what's been called out as table 0, and I can see what's called out as table 1, and I can select things from there. Great, so I selected the table view, I select my table, and I say OK. And that's going to bring in my data. One thing I noticed in this is as I scroll down, I see at the end, in this case, the way they format the data is that at the end of every page, there's a summary, right? And I don't want those summary values in my data. That doesn't look right. I'm going to create my own summaries outside. So what I can do is I say remove bottom rows, remove the bottom 3 rows, and they're gone. So if I scroll down on the page, I can actually see what that looks like here. You see they were including those things. Back to the query editor. So now I think I have a query is pulling in a single page. So if I look at the Box Office Mojo URL here, I see there's actually a page parameter, right? So page 1. And if I click on the second page, I expect that parameter to change. Now it is page 2. Right? And so that's the value I'm going to manipulate to crawl over all of these pages. Let's go back and take a look at how I do this through the UI. See this gear icon down in the corner? This lets, anytime there's a gear, it means that there is some sort of UI associated with that step. And if I click that step, it will relaunch the UI and let me change those values. So if I say click the source, I see that I have my URL as I originally pasted it. And what I'm going to do is zoom in very carefully. And I can see I have my Box Office Mojo and all these parameters. I'm going to split it up. So I want to split it right here, and I want to add an extra part. Paste that down there. Get rid of the number. Add in a number. Verify that my URL still looks OK. I still have the @ there. Let's zoom back out again. So now I've split up my query into multiple parts. And if I take a look at my advanced editor to see what this actually looks like, I see that M is basically tokenized, right? The UI is basically generated this as a tokenized string. So I have my first part, my second part, and my third part. Right? They're being concatenated together with that ampersand thing. And again, this isn't that interesting because it's still hard-coded values. What I can also do in the source is click this drop-down and say new parameter. In this case, I'm going to call this parameter pagenum. I'm concatenating text, so I'm going to explicitly say this is a text value. I say current value is 1. And what this has just done is parameterized this query, so now I have a parameter in my workbook that can be changed. Now, if I was connecting to, and most of our Data Connect UIs have this capability. So I could parameterize, say, the host name of a database I was connecting to, and if I give it to somebody else and they're connecting from, say, dev to test or something like that, they can just change that parameter without having to go in and edit their queries. I can do it for web. I can do it for pretty much any data source that we connect to. Creating parameters also makes it easier to generate functions, as we'll see in a bit. So now I have that page number parameter. I click OK. And it's created this new parameter over on the side. And if I change this value to, say, 5, and click back here, now I see on Polygon rows ranks 400 and above. Right, so it's dynamically put it in. What I can do is right-click on my table and say create function, which is a relatively new feature. It was added in the past 6 months. Let's call this getMojo data. And now it's generated a function for me. And one of the things I want to call out is that once it generates a function, that function pretty much becomes a black box. I can't see what's inside of that function unless I invoke it. And even then, I won't see the internal steps. Okay, so if I wanted to go in and change this function, I would actually have to go in, click the advanced editor to look at the function, and make changes there. But I could invoke this function with, say, OK, let's do page, I don't know, 3. And now I'm getting back data in that. Right, so now I have a function that can pull a given page of data. And if I look at this data, it looks like I have 8 pages. So my next step is to create, again, M doesn't have loop concepts. But what I can do is create a new blank query and create a list of numbers. So 1, 2, I said 8, right? I have a list from 1 to 8. Convert that to a table. Call this pagenum. Change this to text. Go to add column. Before I was clicking that custom column, right? And custom column lets me type in whatever M expression that I want. There's also this insert custom function column, which is basically a helper. Click on that. This lets me pick my Mojo data function that I just created. And lets me map my parameter pagenum. And I click OK. Now I have pagenum and a table of data associated with it. And if I highlight that table, I can see. And if I do an expand, it now expands my data inline. And if I scroll down, I can see I've gone from page 1 to 3 here. Right? Now I've just joined all that data together across all those pages into one. Any questions on that? How that works? OK. So what we used to do was have to bring up the advanced editor and create functions and define and set types and pass it in. What we find is, based on customer feedback, we try to make this as simple as possible, right? And so that invoke custom function dialog helps. The thing that always used to trip me up is I'd forget my function name and I'd have to go back and cancel other dialogs. So yeah, this becomes just a very simple way of calling my functions. One of the other new features that was added, and this is actually one of my favorite features in Power BI Desktop, is the ability to combine files together. So let me show that, and there's a whole experience around this now. So if I want to connect to, say, a folder of files, right? So I click New Query, I click Folder. Let me browse to my folder path, which is going to be here. And I have Excel files in this folder. This might be a common operation that you might do. What this does is give me a preview of the folder itself. It's basically treating the folder like a table in a database. It gives me back different properties. I see I have my Excel files numbered 2005 to 2008. I see different file properties there. I can click Edit. And this brings up this handy UI. And I can do things like filtering on folder path or created by date or whatever I want. What I wanted to call out was this content section. Notice I have a special binary. There's a highlight, which means that it's a structured value of some kind, the name. And that little icon right up in the top corner is called Combine Binaries. And it is a magic button. So when this feature first came out, I used to love to demo this, because basically what I can do is click this and it's going to combine all the binaries together. What it used to do was actually glue the files together, right? And parse it as a single stream. So you can imagine this works if your CSV files are only the first one has headers, for example, and the other ones don't. Otherwise, you have header rows. You're not missing any trailing slashes or trailing new lines at the very end of the file. Otherwise, you end up with 2 rows concatenated together. And people would constantly try to do this with something like Excel files or XML files, things that just can't be parsed as a single stream. So while it made a great demo, it was actually useless in real life. It was more confusing than anything else. It took us 2 years, but we finally fixed it. So that now this button is actually useful, not just demoware. That when you click it, it does a whole bunch of things. Okay? So let me clean this up a little bit. I'm going to delete this. First, I'm going to delete this one, because I want to show which queries actually get generated. Let's delete this group. Great. So here's my Excel data, and I'm going to call this Excel data. Now I'm going to click the Combine Binaries button. And rather than just gluing the files together and giving you an error, it shows you a navigator. And then it shows you, OK, well, this is the actual preview of the data that I want to do. And it says, OK, what sample file do I want to use? And there's a whole drop down. So I could actually, from here, I could click, OK, well, let me see what's in the next file. And click that. OK, now I see a preview of that one, right, which I see is structured the same. And I can click OK. And now it's glued all the files together. And if I scroll down, I see my 2005 data, and I keep scrolling down, and now it's passed into my 2006 data. So it actually has parsed a whole directory of Excel files as a single stream of data and combined them together. If you look on the side, this is where it gets really interesting. So this was my original query, my Excel data query, and so that now has all the combined data together. I see that it's created a function, something that says sample, and then there's some parameters here as well. And this is the feature I like most. So remember I said that once you have a function, it becomes a black box, and I can click on the advanced editor, and it gives me a warning, but I click on the advanced editor, and I can see my function itself is actually pretty simple. It's saying, pass in a parameter, load it as a workbook, and then get the table and promote headers. This is a very, very simple transformation. But I have no way, if I wanted to make changes to that, I'd actually have to go in with this, and I don't have a nice UI around it. It would all be manual. Now what the UI does is generate a sample. Okay, so here I have a transformation sample. And when I make changes to this sample, it actually updates the function for me. So I basically have a visual function builder now. So what I can do is say, let's get rid of extended amount and tax amount. I don't want those columns in my report. I click down here, and I see, OK, well, now my query is broken. But that's because I had a change type. If I remove that, now I see that those 2 columns are gone from my end function as well. So using this mechanism, when you do the combined files, I actually get a visual function builder. And you can imagine that we'd extend this concept out to other types of functions, so that you always, anytime you create a function, you'd have a sample function that you can play with and visually debug functions and change things and make it work. Today, it only works around the combine files button. Right, the other new feature that we've added recently, so I can select all my columns and say transform detect data type. And so this will automatically do my type detection. Now my columns actually have data types associated with it. I can see numbers and decimals, and it's always handy for BI purposes. You always want stronger types. And I can even go back to my sample and remove that step where I remove the columns, click back on Excel data, and those column extended amount is magically back in my sample. Right, so I have this round tripping of being able to edit my queries, update things, and have it update. Other things to note, if I have a useful query, I have a couple of different options. I can enable load, which means it's actually going to load it into the data model. If I turn off enable load, this basically means just keep it in the query editor, never actually load it into the data model. I can duplicate a query. I can reference a query. And I can also choose whether or not to actually refresh it. The include in report refresh, that's when I open up Power BI Desktop, I click the refresh all button. This basically disconnects it from the refresh all, right? So if you don't want to refresh the data, it's pretty static, you can leave it like that. I want to call out reference. This question came up multiple times at the expo hall. When you reference a query is evaluated for every table you load into the data model. Right? So in that Box Office Mojo case, right, where I'm pulling a table, if I say reference this query and do some other transformation, when I do a refresh, both queries will be evaluated in parallel, which means there's no caching. When you do a reference, it's not actually caching the data. You're actually going to see the pages pulled twice. Right? So just something to keep in mind, that doing references doesn't necessarily cache the data. It just means you're going to evaluate those things in parallel. Each table in the Power Pivot model, or in the Excel file, in the Power BI model, gets evaluated in parallel, and there's no caching in between. Okay. So that was end-to-end, quickly creating functions, creating them by hand, as well as the new handy features that let you create combined binary functions across all this. Any questions on this stuff? Yep.
I've had a few queries from people who are wanting to do like archiving of data.
Okay.
Some of the ideas that people had is maybe saying I'm going to untick the include and refresh option.
Right.
Which works for that particular table, but
Yep.
the ideal scenario would be then to merge that in with other tables at that point. And it seems at that point you still have to go and get all of the data.
Queries.
And that refresh.
Right. So the question is around archiving of data and not wanting to refresh certain sets of data. So you uncheck it, and then if you reference it elsewhere that does get loaded into the data model, it will be refreshed if that query is being refreshed. Yeah. So that is very similar to the way Analysis Services Tabular does partitioning. Right? And so if you know about the Power BI architecture, the Power Pivot model and the data model in Power BI, it is Analysis Services Tabular behind the scenes. Analysis Services is sort of the grow-up story. And so that's where when you want to do partitions of data or refresh specific partitions and not others, that's where you cross over from the self-service BI into the more pro BI. And the model that we are doing, and the reason why Power Query is now in Analysis Services Tabular, is it completes our grow-up story. Right, from self-service to BI Pro. Power Pivot was successful because of that grow-up story. You could give out Excel and Power Pivot to analysts. They can create their models, then they can load it up into, once that model becomes useful and IT wants to take it over, you can take it, you deploy it to Analysis Services Tabular instance, and then you can scale it out, you can set security, you can do all that. Power Query broke all that, because once you started using Power Query in Excel and wasn't supported in AS, you completely broke the grow-up story. IT would have to actually rewrite the queries using the supported connectors in AS. The idea behind introducing or moving Power Query over to Power Pivot, in addition to expanding the number of data sources, is to complete that story. So the model would be, I give Power BI Desktop to my analysts, they create something useful, IT wants to take it over, you just take the model as is, And you can imagine a Power BI desktop model kind of being, or file being shredded, right? There's the visuals, there's the data model, which is analysis services, and then there is the queries, which is Power Query, right? And you can imagine over time we'd want to, maybe you could shred it over to RS, the visuals, and the model goes to analysis services, and the data model either refreshes directly from AS Tabular or maybe even in integration services or something like that. So you can fully operationalize and go from that self-service to a Pro BI story. Right, so that was a long way of saying partitioning and archiving of data would likely be more of a BI Pro feature rather than trying to build it off this way. Right. Any other questions? Yeah?
In direct query mode,
Yep.
I'm running into problems where in advanced editor I'm having nested functions and I don't remember the error message, but it doesn't seem to like it.
Right. So the question is around direct query mode. So when I connect to certain data sources, so say 10, 10, 10, 10, I'm connecting to SQL Server, I have these choices, right, of import and direct query. Import basically takes a snapshot of the data. You connect to your data source, you bring it into your local data model. The advantage there is you can do a data mashup, you can connect to multiple data sources, it all comes local. The visuals become very fast, very responsive. Right? As I drag on a visual, it's dynamically building things up all off this in-memory model. When I do a direct query mode, I still have the same query editor, but when I say load, it just brings in metadata. No actual data comes into analysis services. And that when I build a visual, when I drag it on, it dynamically generates a query that goes against the backend source. Right? Direct query becomes useful for a couple of reasons. One is if you want to leave the data in a backend repository and only have the visuals, say, served up from the cloud, which would be a common case. The other would be is if your data set is so big that you can't bring it into a self-service in-memory model and you want to leave it where it is. Import lets you do a full range of transformations because if the backend data source doesn't support a given transformation or function, M will evaluate it locally. In direct query, you're a bit more limited, right? You will only be allowed to do transformations and functions that can be pushed down to the back end, right? And in a direct query mode, if you try to do something that the backend source doesn't support, it will give you that warning saying this combination can't be folded. Please try a simpler query or something along those lines. And so depending on, if you want to come see me at the booth, we can actually go through it. But depending on which functions you're running and the way you're combining the data, that's usually you can't combine the data in there. But yeah, great question. Both modes have their uses. Import gives you the most flexibility in terms of data mashup and stuff and end user performance. But direct query, definitely, you go into a direct query model specifically or especially when you're working with very, very large data sets that you don't want to refresh or bring in. Right? Connecting to a Spark server, for example. We support a limited number of direct query sources. Today, I believe it is SQL, Teradata, Oracle, Redshift, Impala, Snowflake, and analysis services. So you can connect to an actual AS cube with these models. Limits of data set sizes, that's a good question too. So Power BI desktop, or so analysis services, Power Pivot Engine, it's an in-memory, does a column store and row store of data. It's highly compressed. So really the only limits locally is the amount of memory that you have. I've seen Power BI workbooks with 4 billion records in them, and it only took up about 130 megs. You can actually tell how much memory it's going to take just by the file size. Right? Save the file and you'll see the actual size on disk. It's about the same as what it would be in memory. There are limits to how big a file can be to actually deploy up to powerbi.com, and that depends on whether you're in the free SKU or Power BI Pro. Yeah, that can vary. I think it's 250 megs in the free and up to 1 gigabyte in size. How much your data compresses, they say between 10 and 100x. It really depends on how much your data duplicates and things like that. If you have tables of GUIDs that never repeat, you don't get much compression. If you have product listings, customer information, stuff that repeats often, then you get much better compression rates. Okay. Yeah, one more?
So, explained before, you can't do both. They've got multiple data sources. You can't do a direct query and then join import from other.
Right. So today, direct query mode is limited to to a single data source. So if you create a new workbook, you can do direct query as long as you only have one data source that you're connected to. You notice it's grayed out here, and this is because I've already connected to an Excel file here. I already have another source. On our roadmap is to enhance this capability. You can imagine that, yes, you would have a direct query against, thinking about data warehouse, I want to cache all of my dimensions, but I want to do a direct query against my fact table. All right, so we are in the process of enhancing these capabilities. We don't have timelines, but you can imagine this sort of thing being rolled out where you'd have multiple data sources, maybe one direct query source with multiple import sources in the same model. Right? Okay, let me go back to my slides really fast, just some closing things I want to talk about, and then I'll just open it up for questions. So tips and tricks around using the Power Query editors. And one thing you'll notice is, like I said, in Excel 2016, or whether you have the Power Query add-in for Excel 2013, or Power BI Desktop, it's all pretty much the same. It's just slightly skinned differently. Especially the query editor will look the same. In general, people will use the editor to generate the query, to do their transformation, and then go into the advanced editor or the formula bar just to tweak things. I think by our metrics, it's about 80% of people will never touch M, look at M. Everything's done through the UI. Pound shared I talked about. So if you type in pound shared, you can get the full list of functions. You can click on the functions or type in the function name, and you'll get an invocation dialog as well as examples of how to use it. There's also MSDN. There's 2 guides I'll link to at the end. There's a full language spec that talks about M language syntax. It's not that interesting. But there's a formula library as well that will talk about all of our built-in formulas. And as you go through it, you'll see that there's actually a number of transformations that we don't expose in the UI, just because they'd be too complex to figure out to do buttons. But yeah, there's a lot in there that is pretty neat when you start digging into it. Some other tricks, you can remove errors like I did to just get rid of error rows if you're doing quick analysis of data, for example. And I make the joke about self-service BI, and I can do what I want. You don't always want to just remove all your error rows because that changes your data set. But you can also do things like substitute null for errors, for example. So if it's a malformatted column, malformatted value that's not that interesting, you can always just say replace nulls. Replace errors with nulls. And that's that bottom one there, replace errors. Try and otherwise is very helpful. If you, like I said before, it's basically like a throw and a catch. So you can do a try. I could have, for my Box Office Mojo thing, for example, I could have done a try, call my get Mojo data function. And if that fails, I say otherwise null. Rather than having my whole query blow up, I just get back a null value. Table.buffer is interesting. This was very useful a couple years ago when we had a lot of, I wouldn't say a lot, but the occasional folding error. If you think M isn't folding things properly or doing something properly, if you include table.buffer as a step, it stops folding. Everything else from that point on becomes local. It was very useful for debugging, but it's been a long time since I've seen folding errors with our common data sources. Quick things for references. These are the 2 guides. If you search for the Power Query formula reference and formula list, you will get a list of all of the functions that are in the library. This guide updates, or these pages update with each release of Excel as well as releases of Power BI Desktop. There's sometimes some gaps, so there might be some newer functions that aren't there. Like I said, you can always type pound shared to see all available engine functions. Learning path stuff, please fill out an eval so I get invited back if you like this session, if you want to see more about Power Query. Even if you don't like me but you like Power Query, include that feedback too. You can get another speaker to come in. If you want to follow up, Twitter, I'll be in the speaker, not the lounge, but I'll be down in the speaker expo so you can come chat. I'll also be at the Data Insights Ask Me Anything session later on, I think actually the next time slot. And yeah, I will let people go. And if you have any questions, I'm here to answer them. Thanks.